Buonasera a tutti e a tutte, bentrovati a
Good
questo
morning,
nuovo
everyone.
appuntamento.
Welcome to our event. Just some housekeeping to begin with. If you're connected with us through Facebook, you will see the event in Italian. Whilst if you're connected with us through Zoom, you will be able to select the language you want to follow, which will be English in this case. My name is Sabrina Scialdone. I currently study at the Department of Political Sciences, Law and International Studies, and I am part of the Movements for Freedom. 8 months ago, as we know, in Belarus took place the last elections. These were followed by peaceful protests. People were oppressed because of this. The Belarus people is being oppressed by the regime, which are not respecting their rights. Our movement was born about a month ago. This was thanks to the professor Marco Mascia. This professor gave a statement about the current affairs of the situation. Me and my peers were taken aback, especially because people our age in a different country were facing such a situation. They were imprisoned, they were still in prison, they were judged, they had to abandon their country simply because they didn't agree with the government, and they had taken a stand against the violence that was taking place in the country. This was the spark that ignited us to ourselves take a stance and support the Belarusian people. With this event, we hope that we will be able to give a voice to a people that can't express themselves at the moment. This association was a movement born to help Belarus and the people of this country, but we will hope to help other people in the future. Through our Instagram page, we are telling the stories of these students that were taken prisoners. We are broadcasting our initiatives as well. We have also written to the Italian Universities Deans Association for them to take a stance against this situation, and we have addressed European people for them to express their concerns and pressure the European institutions to oppose the Lukashenko's government. We hope we will be able to have a key role in ending this situation. I will give the floor to our first speaker, Ekaterina Ziuziuk, President and Spokeswoman for the Supolska Association in Italy. Good evening, everyone. As Sabrina said, my name is Ekaterina Ziuziuk, and I'm the President and Spokesperson for the Supolska Association in Italy. Our association was born on the 22nd of June 2020. We wanted to support the popular movement for democracy in Belarus. We took part in protests every week from the 28th of June until the 9th of August. We thought that was our work, but after the sham of the elections and the violence, we understood that our work was just started. Our first aim was to inform the Italian society on what was happening in Belarus. we are trying to give a voice to people who haven't got one. This is the aim of Belarusian people all over the world. The movement was a grassroots movement that emerged at once in countries where Belarusian people have been living. Belarusian people living abroad up until 2020 didn't know each other and weren't very concerned about the situation back in our own country. I've spoken a lot about what's happening in Belarus, and I want to cut to the chase today. I won't speak about what has happened until today, because our other speakers today will tell their story in greater detail. These accounts will give you a better idea of what has happened in Belarus up until today, and theirs will be first-hand accounts. In Belarus at the moment, we are seeing a situation where the government has been taken over by criminals. There's a mafia boss with his accomplices. Of course, I'm talking about Lukashenko, who's ordered the elections to be rigged, and his accomplices have complied with his order. His accomplices have then shot, killed, beaten and raped protesters on his orders. There have been 1,000 cases of certified and confirmed tortures and 4 cases of death. This is just the tip of the iceberg, because in Belarus the law isn't working anymore. There's a Russian term that roughly translates to zeroing of the law. This refers to the fact that the Belarusian authority are doing whatever they want to the people of their country without being held accountable. Trials are taking place where witnesses are witnessing with their face covered and using false names, confirming the version of the authorities over the ones of the defendants. In Belarus, there's the burden of the defense, and it's the defendant that has to prove he's innocent, not the other way around. And at the moment, this is virtually impossible. It's very rare that someone is released being cleared of the charges. The media representation of the situation is totally distorted. They're reporting funds from abroad to finance these protests, and they're saying that people are paid to participate in these protests. Belarusian people living abroad are being smeared. Our own activists have been described as escort that came to Italy by marrying retired people, and of course this is not true. The news that we receive from Belarus reminds us today from the time of war. Riot patrols are breaking into people's houses and people live in fear of being arrested. Our country is turning into North Korea. In the past few weeks, a law has been passed and it makes it impossible for people to be journalists. This is a profession that has been dangerous for quite some time in Belarus, and independent news outlets and their website have been prohibited and taken down as they were deemed extremists from the government. Reporting on protests in Belarus at the moment is considered the same as taking part in these protests, and the right of protest doesn't exist in Belarus anymore. In order to protest in Belarus, you need authorization from the government, and without such approval, you cannot protest legally. Volunteers of various NGOs have been arrested throughout the country. Marta Rokova, for example, is an activist that has been jailed since September 2020, and she's facing 12 years of jail time simply because after the elections she has been involved in a campaign to gather witness statements from people that had been oppressed or were being oppressed by the government. The flag that you see behind me, if you show this flag in Belarus, you're considered a criminal. Even if you're wearing clothes that have red and white on them, that is considered a crime at the moment. This is a statement that the government interprets as dissent. You will be taken as an example. There is no further personal space or privacy. If you are stopped by the authorities, they will ask to look at your phone, and the password for it will be taken by force. You cannot receive money from abroad anymore, and if you receive a wire transfer with funds from abroad, your account will be blocked and seized. The regime is trying to stop Belarusian people from abroad helping those left in the country. Starting from the 21st of December 2020, land borders have been shut down with the pretext of COVID-19, but luckily you can still leave the country via air transport. Exemptions still apply, of course, but you need to prove that your travel is essential. The Iron Curtain, therefore, is evermore there. Conditions in jails are not acceptable, and people are not treated with dignity. They are being tortured, they sleep in mattressless bed or on the floor because the cells are overcrowded and there's no beds for everyone. Prisoners have no access to the shower room, and they will have to clean themselves with water with bleach that's been thrown on the floor by the guards. People are being beaten in jails and people are protesting. Today we'll mainly focus on academia, which means we'll look at student protests and professors that were involved in peaceful protests, but that doesn't mean that other parts of the Belarusian society are not involved in these protests. Old, young men, women, even disabled people were taking part in the peaceful protests all over the country. Today, it's an important date for us. It's the 9th of April, and 8 months have elapsed since the elections were rigged, where our vote were being robbed and state terrorism began. The government can now do anything to anyone without being held accountable. As I said, 1,000 certified cases of torture and 4 deaths, but not one single investigation has been launched by the government. Victims are being blamed and are now painted as the criminal. During protests in August, on the 21st of August to be more specific, the activist Paolo said that if we didn't win, the country would transform in a concentration camp, and he was later arrested that night. He's now 36, but his first protest was when he was 16. He's Well, he was right when he said that the country would have turned into a concentration camp if we didn't win. And Belarus indeed has turned into a concentration camp now. We have been resisting not just for 8 months, but for the past 20 years. For the last 20 years, people have always protested. People that were teenagers back then, as Pavel or his friend Eugen or Pavel Seviarisnets. They were just teenagers back then and are fully grown men now. They've sacrificed their lives against this dictatorship. They have been persecuted, jailed, and now prisons are overcrowded with people born and after Lukashenko take power, and we hope for them that this will all be over soon and will remain their only experience of such a situation. Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to Natalia Dolina. She is an ex-associate of the University of Minsk, and she's one of the best Italianists from Belarus. Thank you very much. Today I would like to talk about the academia world and its peculiarities, but let's take a step back. What's happening in Belarus at the moment is being broadcast to the whole world, and we have been talking about this. It has been widely covered in the news as well. Everyone has seen what has happened and what is still happening. All over the world, people can still follow what is taking place in our country. However, I believe that to better understand why this is happening, and specifically I'm talking about the fact that more than 40 university students have been jailed for several months with charges ranging from promoting or having participated in protests. We need to take a step back. These are young students and young people. And back in the Soviet Union era, when the Soviet Union represented the primary example of a totalitarian state, back then, as you know, Belarus wasn't the only country part of the Union. It was part of the Union together with the Baltic states and many others. During that time, the idea was that everybody had to be equal. All university students had to follow the same curriculum. And young people were taught to stay silent, or at least pretend to obey. In today's world, the approach towards certain brackets of the population that were discriminated against before is changing, and I'm talking about those that had been discriminated because of their age. We're talking about ageism, which is a discrimination against older people. But back in the days, it was the young people that were being discriminated against. They had to do what the adults said. Why am I talking about this phenomenon? Young people and society at large were accustomed and used to this. They adjusted to this new reality. This, however, didn't mean that young people weren't active or expressed their ideas, including political opinions. They were used to what surrounded them, and that's just what the world was back then. At the beginning of the 90s, we had the famous so-called political thaw. The situation changed rapidly after the crumbling of the Soviet Union, and Belarus, along other countries from the Soviet bloc, definitely felt these changes. The approach to young people changed, and going back to academia now, during the Soviet Union era, universities were free to attend, but it was difficult to get in. After the Soviet Union crumbled, universities changed as well, and it was possible for people to pay in order to attend university courses. This meant that young people had to sort themselves out, basically. This for me is a positive thing because they had to look for a job in order to pay for their studies, and they felt much more responsible and more free. This, however, didn't last so long because with the coming to power of Lukashenko, the situation went back to what it was during the Soviet Union, but the world had changed in the meantime, and Belarus became a Soviet Union island. In this island, you could find the heritage of the Soviet Union, and this is how our country was seen, a museum of the Soviet Union that remained in the heart of Europe. The country was then brought back to the past, and totalitarianism crept back. This is important because we're talking today about academic freedom. At university, the curriculum, on top of specialist subjects, people had to attend ideologically based subjects. They were seen by the students as an inevitable burden to be bared with. This was brought back with Lukashenko's coming to power. Academia was made to be more ideological and more controlled. We need to remember that we have been allowed to participate to the Bologna process. This is despite the fact that Belarus doesn't meet the criteria to participate in this academic system. Everybody knows that, and our deans are not elected by the university population. However, they are elected by the government. Universities have very little autonomy. To be honest, they really don't have any. And I will give you another example of this. This example shows clearly, I'm not sure how to phrase it. Shall we say that this example shows how totalitarianism was still present in Belarus. In the days running up to the elections, as you know, Lukashenko has been in power for the last 20 years, but elections took place every 5 years. The situation that created itself in the run-up of every single election for the past 20 years reminded me of the plot of the Hollywood movie the Groundhog Day, where the main character is stuck in a day that keeps repeating and where everything happens in the exact same way. As I was saying, a week before every election, and this is the experience that I've had at the University of Minsk, but I have reason to believe it is an accurate representation of what was happening in other universities as well in Belarus. Our dean alerted the students saying that they had to take part in the elections and vote. They had to vote early, though. As you know, you can vote early during elections if you can't go vote on election date because you're not in your hometowns or because of other reasons. The dean said to the students that they had to vote early, especially to the students coming from outside the city because they were staying in students' hostel and they really needed that accommodation. According to what the university set out, students had to vote early and leave the university on the Saturday, Sunday to go back home. Why did this happen? Early voting, you may know, is easier to rig. This is because during the early stages of voting, commissioners don't have the same access to the voting process, and therefore the state took advantage of this situation, pushing students to vote earlier. But it doesn't stop here. The dean also told the students that on the Saturday before the elections, no university lessons would take place, and therefore they were free to go back home and leave the university. The university administration threatened the students, saying that had they not voted early and then left Minsk, they would have lost their accommodation in the students' hostel. I said to the students that if all of them decided not to follow what the university said, the university wouldn't have been able to make them lose their place at the hostel. This is because there is simply strength in numbers, and the students understood this, but they were too scared to do it. Their parents as well were concerned and asked the students to comply and do what they were instructed to do. This continued and repeated itself up until the last election. What happened then? To be completely honest with you, I didn't think that anything would have changed. I had worked for 29 years at that university up until when I was recently let go. I had witnessed, therefore, this had happened many times in the run-up to an election. What happened this year, though, I saw students that were used to be silent and they were interested in other parts of life, leaving politics on the side. They changed their behavior. All over the country in Belarus, university term starts on the 1st of September. And this year, the academic year was kicked off by a student protest. Some of the students were arrested. Many other things happened at the beginning of the academic year. And on the 17th of October, a students' march was organized. Some students were sentenced to 10 to 15 days of jail because they took part in this protest. On the 26th of October, a national strike was launched. Many people took part in this strike. Students also participated, and this goes to show that the students' movement was growing by the day. One of the more tragic events of the more recent months was the so-called Black Thursday. On this day, many students who were protesting were arrested. Their phones, computers, and other devices were seized because the state thought that with information on these devices, it could prove the students were guilty. These students were taken to a KGB building. They were kept there for a few weeks and then transferred to another location. According to the law, Belarusian citizens can be held up until 18 months, having been charged, waiting then for the final sentence of the trial. These students have been charged, but they are being still held in the prison. So what does this all mean? So far, we've only spoken about students, but professors as well were arrested, were held, and the whole of the Belarusian society has been affected by these protests. Not just students, but doctors, lawyers, regular people, everyone has been affected. Everyone is a criminal and a danger to the regime. Why is the state targeting students in particular? Do you remember when we talked about ageism at the start of my speech? Ageism against young people. Well, this is now happening again in our country because the state understands that young generations represent the future of our country and they are a threat to the regime. I don't think the state realized what would have happened, and they really hoped that young people and students would just comply as they always did. A few months ago, some of my students told me that this repression, this oppression from the state, confirmed to them that the regime is scared, and that means students can change the country. They have a role to play in changing and shaping the future of our country. This is much more important to me than the result of this whole situation. As a professor, as someone who has worked for years with young people and students, I am really proud that the students showed such a sense of freedom. We have to foster this. We have to nurture this. I am extremely proud of this. It is very important to me that they understand and believe they are important. Young people can change the world, and I strongly believe that this is the case. What is happening right now in Belarus just confirms it. Thank you very much to the whole world, to those who have supported us, to those who have followed our dramatic situation, and to those who have expressed their solidarity. I'd like to thank also those who have taken action and contributed to our fight. In my opinion, it's very important we continue to support young people and students for two reasons. Firstly, these are not terrorists. These are good people and they have done nothing wrong. They have always protested peacefully from the beginning. They do not deserve at all what is being done to them. The violence, the persecution, they have been shown by the regime. The second reason is that we need to understand this might happen anywhere in the world. There will always be people who are braver than others, and there will always be people who will have the courage to stand up and fight. The solidarity shown to these people, these students who weren't afraid to stand up and speak their mind, is very important. This is an example that those who have not dared talk can follow. It is important for young people to understand that they can shape the future. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ekaterina, for your speech, and I'll now give the floor to Professor Angela Di Gregorio. She's Professor of Comparative Public Law at the Department of International, Legal, Historical and Political Studies at the University of Milan, one of the founding universities of SAR, Scholars at Risk.
Buonasera a tutti, mi sentite bene?
Thank you for inviting me to this meeting. It's quite important for the survival of this country. I will try to give you a brief description of Scholars at Risk. It's a network. There is an Italian branch as well. I feel personally involved in this, seen as during my academic activity, I've always dealt with former Soviet and former communist countries. I have many dear friends and colleagues in many of these countries, including Belarus. Therefore, taking part in this event, which aims to raise awareness, is something that I feel fairly close to me, even though I am not from Belarus myself. Right now, I feel somewhat Belarusian me too. Scholars at Risk is a network, a partnership existing among various universities, people and others. It was founded in the US, aiming to protect so-called scholars at risk. However, by scholars, we don't simply mean researchers and professors. When we look at what is happening in Belarus, for instance, academic freedom here, and not only here, refers to a series of freedoms. It is a bit of a litmus test of other types of freedom of association, freedom of expression, and others. All of these lead to the self-determination, to the freedom to vote, and to democracy. Ultimately, to the freedom to choose your own democratic destiny. This is something that we give for granted in Italy because we haven't had to fight for them, or perhaps the former generations have had to do so, but we do not understand what this means. This is something that is quite relevant for Belarusian people. As my colleague Natalia was saying, 30 years ago, they already had to fight to get some sort of freedom. This is the time when, together with other countries, most notably the Baltic countries, there was a human chain. As a reminder, people met throughout these 3 Baltic countries holding hands to express the intention to make the regime fall. So they had to fight for this freedom a long time ago already. What does Scholars at Risk do? It protects scholars. This also refers to students. The definition of scholar, therefore, is not limited to academic staff in the traditional sense. it has many important goals. I would like to mention two. One is hosting at-risk scholars, people that need to be welcomed to a university belonging to the network outside their country of origin. Throughout 2020, the year of pandemic, thanks to SAR Italy, we were able to host many scholars coming from Turkey, Afghanistan, and other Middle Eastern countries. We mainly protect people from this kind of situations. Belarus, for us, is a slightly odd case, as it is a European country. Protecting scholars in a country that has agreed to the Bologna process is somewhat absurd if we think about it. On top of this more tangible activity, we carry out another very important activity, and this is what we're doing right now. That is to say, advocacy, raising awareness, bringing information to the attention of the Italian or international community and making them aware of these situations, these dangerous situations, situations which jeopardize the freedom and the health and security of these scholars, but at large of the entire academic community. Scholars are perhaps the future direction of the country, those that aim to change the country. I would have many things to say. That said, I do not want to steal time from those that I believe are better suited to outline what can be tangibly done to help these people. We have provided assistance to the Supolka Association in drafting a letter that will be circulated throughout the various universities belonging to the network. This received the support of the Italian Deans Association. This is a very important entity that is quite prestigious abroad. We therefore are fully committed to raise awareness on what is happening right now. Scholars looking into these countries exist and are part of the network, but they are only a small community. I would like to mention a couple of things, even though I am not myself from Belarus. Just a couple of words on what is happening in the country. We have spoken at length about fighting against a dictator that has been in power for quite a long time. I do not know how many terms is served with no boundaries. That said, we shouldn't look at what's happening in Belarus as something quite removed from the rest of the former Soviet countries. There are implications in terms of geopolitics and international relations that permeate the entire area, the former Soviet Union. Previous speakers referred to the dynamics that have happened over the last 30 years. There are many stakeholders, and the risk is that this country would become a stage where many other stakeholders intervene. This is what happened in Ukraine. The two situations are fairly different, but I think it's quite important to shine a light on the protests being carried out by the opposition, such as what Tikhanovskaya is doing from abroad. I also believe it's important to be as peaceful as possible. The risk otherwise would be to kickstart civil war dynamics, something which is not good at this moment. We shouldn't underestimate the various stakeholders at play, for instance, Russia. We shouldn't underestimate the relationships between Belarusian people and Russia. These are not by all means similar to the relation between Russia and Ukrainians. However, we should exert diplomatic pressure on the government, all the while maintaining a peaceful dialogue. I'd like to wrap up with a couple of words that refer back to what I was saying about academic freedom. We are not saying here that the academic freedom is being quashed. Students are the main victims of these repressions. Therefore, it's their personal freedom that's being attacked. If I am not wrong, in Belarus, these repressions had never taken place in Belarus. The shocking aspect is the unprecedented level of violence that was reached in this country. And this is not to mention that if you attack students, you are attacking your future. This is because students are our future. They are our future leaders. I will stop there. Thank you very much for involving me. Thank you. I will now give the floor to Jan Salanowi, a former student of Belarusian State University of Informatics and Radioelectronics. He was arrested because he took part in peaceful protests, and he was sentenced to more than 120 days in jail. He was then suddenly freed before his term was due and had to flee the country. His speech will be consecutively interpreted into Italian.
Здравствуйте. Хотелось бы прежде всего представиться. Меня зовут Саланови, мне 21 год, и я бывший студент Белорусского государственного университета информатики и радиоэлектроники. Я учился на последнем курсе в ГУИРа. В ноябре меня арестовали, присудили на 114 суток ареста и отчислили из университета. Не буду долго ходить вокруг да около, сразу к делу.
Hello. First of all, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Jan Salanowi, I'm 21, and I'm a former student of the Belarusian State University of Informatics and Radioelectronics. I did my last year there. In November, I was arrested and imprisoned for 114 days, then expelled by the university. However, I won't waste more time and get straight to the point.
Почему я ходил на митинги? По моим наблюдениям, жить в Беларуси становилось все сложнее и сложнее с каждым годом. Постоянно росли цены на все – еду, одежду, топливо. Когда я был маленький, папа ездил работать в Германию, привозил игрушки и шоколадки, мама занималась делами по дому. Потом денег перестало хватать. Маме тоже пришлось найти работу. Сейчас процесс повторяется. Все это сопровождается разговорами как в доме, так и в школе на тему того, что во всем виновата власть. Я раньше занимался карате, и меня очень часто ездили за границу на соревнования. Я лично наблюдал контраст, как из года в год растут города в Польше, Литве. В то же время Минск не менялся вовсе. Мы продолжали жить в серой, тесной и ухоженной панельке времен Советского Союза.
A first question you may ask me is, why did I attend a protest? I realized that year after year had become more and more difficult. Prices went up all the time, and this applied to food, clothes, fuel, and so on and so forth. When I was a kid, my dad would travel to Germany for work and bring me back toys and chocolates, while my mother looked after the house. It was all fine, and then we didn't have enough money anymore. My mum had to find a job, and now it's happening again. All of that while at home and at school we keep on saying that the government is to be blamed for all of this. Before I used to do karate and we would often take part in competitions abroad. Cities in Poland and Lithuania would develop year after year, whilst Minsk was always the same. I saw it with my own eyes. We used to live in the traditional Soviet-style apartment blocks, all grey and run down.
Пару лет назад в России Алексей Навальный снял фильм «Он вам не Димон». Тогда я понял, насколько наглым, жадным, отвратительным и беспринципным может оказаться человек. Я начал интересоваться политикой, смотреть политологов, читать различные статьи на тему того, почему государство не развивается и почему с каждым днем мы живем все хуже и хуже. В результате я пришел к выводу, что все, что нас окружает, зависит от управления страной, и что основа успеха– сменяемость власти. Исходя из этого, с декабря 2019 года я всех своих знакомых уговаривал сходить на выборы и проголосовать. Показывал, рассказывал, почему это важно, пытался переубедить, что их голос важен. И у меня получилось. Множество из тех, с кем я общался, сходили на выборы и поставили подпись за единственного альтернативного кандидата – Светлану Тихановскую. Однако 9 августа стало известно, что нас всех обманули, что фюрер нарисовал себе 80% голосов. Это означает, что 8 из 10 человек должны поддерживать действующую власть. Однако за весь период с декабря 2019 года по текущее время я знаю только одного человека, который сходил и проголосовал за бывшего президента. Это стало главной причиной того, что я ходил на митинги. Борьба за справедливость и улучшение уровня жизни для всех и себя в первую очередь.
A few years back, in Russia, the He Is Not Demon to You documentary by Alexei Navalny alleging corruption by the then Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev came out. That's where I understood how arrogant, power-thirsty, brutal and unscrupulous you can be. I got interested in politics. I started following political commentators and reading articles detailing why the country was not moving forward, why every day we were worse off. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that everything boils down to the way a country is managed. Therefore, changing the person at the top was our only hope. That's why, as of December 2019, I started convincing all of the people I know to go vote. I explained and outlined why it was important they made their voice heard. And it worked. Many of those I spoke to went to vote and voted for the only alternative candidate, that is to say, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Yet, on August the 9th, we found out we had all been taken for a ride. The dictator claimed he had won with 80% of the votes. This would mean that 8 people out of 10 voted for the current government. Yet, since December 2019, I have only met one person who voted for former President Lukashenko. That's the main reason why I took to the streets. I wanted to fight for justice and ask for better life conditions for all of us. And for myself too.
Вопрос 2. Как проходили митинги? Я являюсь свидетелем того, что митинги проходили всегда мирно. Начиная с 9 августа я не видел ни одного камня, ни одного коктейля Молотова, никаких ударов по сотрудникам милиции. Напротив, я лично видел, как с ними пытались разговаривать, доказывать им, что они неправы, проводить доводы и аргументы. Но это не сработало. Людей закидали гранатами, избивали, расстреливали. Около меня взрывались гранаты, на меня направляли лазерные слюкозатели травматических ружей и приказывали сдаваться. Распыляли средоточивый газ. И все это из-за того, что я просто стоял на тротуаре в центре города. 16 августа состоялся, на мой взгляд, самый масштабный митинг. Я такого никогда не видел. Куда ни посмотри, везде были люди. Они гуляли, дарили друг другу радость и смех, самоорганизовывались. Пропускали транспорт, подвозили воду. Было очень радостно видеть, что ты не один, и что тебя окружает множество хороших людей. Но спустя некоторое время перемирие закончилось. Опять начались пытки, расстрелы, задержания. Если подытожить, то насилие я лично видел со стороны только сотрудников милиции.
Question number 2. What were the protests like? I can confirm protests were always peaceful. Since August the 9th, I have not seen any stones, Molotov cocktails or anyone assaulting law enforcement forces. Quite the opposite, I saw how we would engage with them, trying to explain and make them understand why they weren't right. It didn't work. They threw grenades at protesters, beat them up, shot them. Many grenades went off near where I was standing. I was aimed at with the infrared light from a non-lethal weapon and ordered to surrender. I was showered in tear gas. And only because I happened to be on the sidewalk in the city centre. I think the mass gathering on August 16th was the biggest ever, and law enforcement forces were not present. It was unprecedented. There were people as far as the eye could see. They all walked, cheered up to each other, moved away to let public transport through, went for water. It was heartwarming to see I was not alone, and I was surrounded by so many beautiful people. This truce, however, was not meant to last. Tortures, shootings, and arrests quickly followed suit. To sum it up, I would say law enforcement officers were the only ones using violence.
Вопрос 3. Как меня арестовали? Я шел по тротуару. В момент, когда проходил мимо отряда милиции, им поступил приказ хватать людей. Меня тут же остановили и спросили, куда я иду. Я ответил, что домой. Это была правда, так как я уже слышал стрельбу и решил, что сегодня умирать или оставаться калекой не хочу. Меня повалили на землю и начали бить по голове, пытаясь арестовать. Так как рядом было много человек, им это удалось. Меня поволокли в автозак, где еще раз ударив меня в грудь, затолкали в сидячий чек со связанными руками. Дальше нас доставили в отдел милиции.
Question number 3. How was I arrested? I was walking on the sidewalk. Then, as soon as we passed by the law enforcement officer division, they were told to arrest people. They stopped me straight away and asked me where I was going. I said home, which was true. I heard gunshots and decided I did not want to die or be seriously injured that day. They tackled me to the ground and started to hit me on the head to arrest me. They got away with it because there were many of them. They threw me onto the van, where they once again hit me on the chest, tied my hands and forced me to sit down. Then we were taken to the police station.
Так как я работал в научно-техническом центре КГБ, за мной через некоторое время приехали люди из отдела собственной безопасности КГБ и увезли в центральный аппарат. Мне говорили, что сейчас мы с тобой поговорим, и завтра ты уже будешь дома. Я был в полной уверенности, что все хорошо. Однако там на меня начали оказывать давление. Начали угрожать уголовным делом, намекать, что доказательства у них найдутся, если надо будет. Таким образом, под угрозами, находясь в состоянии аффекта, при необъяснении мне моих прав и свобод, я был вынужден свидетельствовать против самого себя. Далее меня доставили обратно в милицию, а оттуда в тюрьму. Как потом оказалось, на одном из судов мои показания поступили в милицию. Однако вместо того, чтобы судить меня разом за все эпизоды, мой процесс растянули. В результате вместо 25 максимальных суток мне дали 114.
As I worked for the Belarusian KBG Technical Scientific Department, a while later a couple of people from the security division came to pick me up, to take me to the central administrative office. They said they just wanted a word with me and that I would be sent home the following day. I was fully convinced I would be okay. Then they started pressuring me. They threatened to take criminal action against me, said they would find the evidence if needed. This way, under threat and in the state I was in, without anyone actually having explained my rights and freedoms to me, they made me testify against myself. Then they took me back to the police station and from there to prison. I ended up in court, where at the hearing I found out the police had a file on me. Yet, rather than charging me directly on all counts, they took their time. As a result, I was sentenced to 114 days in prison instead of the usual 25.
Вопрос 4. Условия содержания. Камеры тесные, сырые, холодные. Все в плесени, повсюду бегают насекомые. Полная антисанитария. Окна в некоторых камерах выбиты, а в некоторых не открываются вовсе. Либо очень холодно, либо очень жарко. В результате этого ты всегда болеешь. Медицинская помощь не оказывают. Если требуешь, начинают угрожать, бить, наказывать карцером. Отселяют бомжей с овшами, наркоманов, алкоголиков, сумасшедших и больных. Постоянное перенаселение. 5 человек в двухместной камере. Никаких мер по противодействию коронавирусной инфекции. На прогулку за 2 месяца вывели 2 раза, но потом начали водить 1 раз в 3 дня. В душ не водили ни разу за все время.
Question number 4. What was it like in prison? Cells are narrow, grey, cold and very mouldy. There are insects everywhere, basically a death trap. The windows in some of the cells are broken, while in others they don't even open. As a result, you're either very cold or very hot, and getting ill is just too easy. No medical assistance is provided. If you ask for it, you're threatened, beaten, or thrown into solitary confinement. They put together homeless people with lice, drug addicts, alcoholics, nutters, and sick people. Prisons are always overcrowded. They squeeze in 5 people in a cell that would host 2. There are no anti-COVID measures. In 2 months, we were let outside only twice. Then they started taking us once every 3 days. In the meantime, however, we were never allowed near a shower.
Еды невероятно мало. 4 столовые ложки овсянки на завтрак для взрослого человека. Сырые котлеты, котлеты с костями и внутренними органами. Хлеб второсортный, заплесневелый, твердый как кирпич. Все холодное. В результате половина скудного рациона выкидывается. Воды нет. Приходилось пить ржавую воду из крана. Иногда и вовсе не кормили. Постоянное унижение личности. Психологическое давление. Запрещали сидеть и лежать. Забрали матрасы. Мы спали на стальных прутьях. Было очень больно и холодно. Иногда не выключали свет. Вывели в минус 15 на улицу на час в майке и шортах за то, что прилег на прутьях, так как разболелась спина от сидения. Забирали и не передавали вещи. Не отправляли и не передавали письма. Игр нет. Литературы нет. Средства личной гигиены не выдавали. Все, что ты мог делать, смотреть в стену напротив, причем желательно стоя.
You get very little food. Adults receive 4 tablespoons of porridge for breakfast. Then you get grey meat, so-called steaks full of bones and offal. The bread is sopa, mouldy, hard as a rock, and everything is stone cold. You end up throwing away half of that meagre portion. They don't give you any water either. You're forced to drink the rusty water dripping from the tap. And sometimes you don't even get fed. Every day you're subjected to psychological torture and humiliation. We couldn't lay down or sit down. Mattresses were forbidden too. We had to sleep on aluminium bars. It was incredibly cold and painful. Sometimes they wouldn't even switch off the lights. If you lay down because it was too painful to sit down, you were taken outside in minus 15 degrees, only wearing shorts and a t-shirt. They took away our belongings. We never received parcels from our relatives or parents. They would not send or deliver letters. There were no games or books. You were given no personal hygiene items. Basically, your only choice was to stare at the walls, preferably standing.
Вопрос 5. Как дела у студентов? В университетах теперь запрещены любые массовые мероприятия. В некоторых университетах преподаватели или администрация вызывают ОМОН на студентов, передают их личные данные в КГБ. ОМОН хватает студентов прямо в здании университета. В экономическом университете студентам предлагали деньги, чтобы те сдавали своих одногруппников и однокурсников, которые хоть как-то вовлечены в протестную деятельность. В медицинском университете сейчас запрещено подходить к окнам, заходить в аудиторию без преподавателя, отпускать студентов во время занятий, даже в туалет. Студентов арестовывают за расклейку стикеров. За административное правонарушение студентов отчисляют, сразу дают писать повестку в военкомат. Постоянные проверки. Администрация посещает общежития. Ущемляют деятельность свободных студенческих профсоюзов. Сбор подписей под коллективным обращением – это тоже массовое мероприятие, нарушающее правила университета. На собрании профсоюзов совершаются рейды с последующим задержанием их участников. Активистов задерживают. Хочется подытожить тем, что методы и средства удержания власти неадекватны и напоминают геноцид евреев. Людей преследуют за мысли преступления и то, чего они не совершали.
Question number 5. How are Belarusian students doing? Public events are completely forbidden in universities. In some universities, professors or the administration would call the riot police and pass on students' personal details to the KGB. The riot police arrest students inside university buildings. Students at the University of Economics, for instance, were offered money to leak data belonging to their peers who are somewhat involved in protests. University of Medicine students are forbidden from going anywhere near windows, entering the room without a professor present, or leaving the classroom, even if only to go to the toilet. Students are arrested for posting stickers. For so-called administrative crimes, students are expelled and immediately conscripted. There are constant controls. The university administration inspects student houses. Free student unions are also forbidden. Raids take place during student union meetings. Even gathering signatures is against the rules of the university. Participants are arrested. Activists are arrested. To sum up, the methods and means used to stay in power are poor and reminiscent of the genocide of the Jews. People are persecuted just because they dare to think differently and for crimes they haven't even committed.
Вопрос 6. Чем помочь? Я не имею достаточной компетенции и полномочий, чтобы ответить на него правильно и полностью. Однако я считаю, что в первую очередь надо помочь репрессированным, отчисленным из университетов студентам. Под этим я имею в виду выделение стипендий и мест в университетах, чтобы они могли закончить учебу и приносить пользу обществу. Потребуются также курсы итальянского языка.
Final question, how can we help? I don't have the necessary knowledge or authorization to fully and correctly reply to this question. That said, I think that first and foremost, we should help students who were oppressed and kicked out of universities. More specifically, we should offer them bursaries at universities so they can finish their studies and become active members of the society. We would also need Italian language courses. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. The last speaker is Professor Paolo De Stefani, Associate Professor of International Law in the Department of Political Science, Law and International Studies at the University of Padua. Thank you. Trying to add something onto what has already been said by Jan and Natalia is almost useless, quite frankly. Over these last few months, or rather over these last few years, we have seen quite a lot of protests. And what we've seen following the shambolic elections in 2020 is not dissimilar to what has happened following every other election in the past. Quite systematically, after each election, which is always won by Lukashenko with at least 80% of the votes, there are protests. Belarusian electors were quite surprised this summer when they found out that Lukashenko had allegedly won with 80% of the votes. It was the same surprise they had at the previous election when, again, he claimed he had won with 80% of the votes. This is a regime that started in 1994, and it's clear that it's working against the interests of the citizens of Belarus. I think that this is quite clear, despite the neo-Soviet rhetoric or the glossy Stalinist reminders. Lukashenko's regime is using all of these characteristics. It's a way that this regime is using to target young people, students most notably, to make them regret not living in this past. All of this is not new. As I was saying, after each election there are protests. These are fairly natural and spontaneous. People realize that this is absurd, and that this is something that keeps on repeating. And these are followed by repression. The repression destroys the resistance, the that students, activists, and bloggers have come up with. It's quite clear, and this is something that has been studied as well by political academics. The procedure here is the same. The regime leaves a certain room for maneuver to opposition parties, states that there will be elections, that there will be many candidates. Sometimes these other candidates are somewhat gotten rid of the day before the election. Then the elections are rigged in order to prove that opposition candidates did not reach the necessary threshold to beat the current leader, Lukashenko in this instance, and his clique. Then what follows is to exploit the legitimate rage that opposition candidates and representatives showcase by taking to the streets to create a terror regime. This is used to destroy the political parties that had been created in the meantime, to further destroy the opposition for the following years, and to make it impossible to react. All of this will last for the following years until we reach a new election, which again will be shambolic. And the same pattern will follow. I think one of the aspects that destroys morally people that are fighting to achieve more justice and more rights for everyone is not only the physical, tangible repression that they are victim of. There's also something else, the impunity, the total impunity that the puppet masters behind this violence actually enjoy. From the law enforcement forces that seize mobile phones and steal them, take them away from protesters, including minors, all the way to the leaders. It's also impossible to trust these state institutions, and by all means these are the same state institutions you've just voted for. We know that when looking at Europe, and more precisely at the different international organizations that countries in Europe are members of, we know that Belarus is quite atypical. It doesn't take part in many international organizations, with the exception of some so-called technical ones. For instance, the Bologna process. These are the bare minimum that allow the country to maintain a certain position. This is what allows Lukashenko to continue his regime. They say that there is some sort of welfare, that citizens are protected, safeguarded, that they are not exposed to the risks of a society that is too free, too capitalist, and so on and so forth. Therefore, what is used to continue this appearance of benefits that the population happens to enjoy is kept. In terms of political organizations, however, the situation is quite different. Political organizations that fight for democracy or for rights are avoided altogether. The same applies to the country also agreeing to any form of international monitoring. They are not in the Council of Europe and they are not therefore subjected to monitoring by the Human Rights Court. The latter, albeit with some difficulty, shines a light on the abuse and the lack of the rule of law in some countries, including Russia and Turkey. Belarus decided to extract itself from the participation to all of these international organizations. The same applies to the UN. The Belarusian constitution, for instance, is not atypical in Eastern Europe, as it recognizes the superiority of international legislation as opposed to national legislation. That said, there's no tangible application of these international standards. Belarus ratified a few human rights conventions. However, since 2012, a special rapporteur of the Human Rights Council should be taking care of Belarus, except this person was never allowed to set foot in Belarus. All of the reports that this person produces on a yearly basis are usually drafted and created by speaking to people who left the country, and therefore the contents of these reports are purely based on witness statements from people that have already left. Many countries and organizations look into what's happening in Belarus without there being any repercussions on what's happening tangibly inside the country. Having contacts with associations representing people that have left the country is quite helpful. If anyone else is interested, they can also read what is the reports that have been drafted by the European institutions, by the UN, for instance. There is one dating to a couple of months ago on the violence that have followed the elections. This is a report that was published in late February. It details the same things that Jan mentioned. It says that the elections were rigged, and notwithstanding, nothing was done by the national authorities. It says as well that following the elections, people were deprived of the right to peaceful demonstration, the freedom of expression. Most notably, this applies to not journalists. They weren't allowed to use the internet, for instance, and this is obviously in fear that information may be circulated, information being against the regime, obviously. This goes against the freedom of expression of journalists and of all citizens. There have been arbitrary detentions and imprisonments. Trials were conducted without respecting personal freedoms. For instance, there was no police arrest, or people were kept in prison without a judge being involved. Also forced disappearances. People disappear for days and no one seems to know where they are. There have been instances where people were taken by these masked men belonging to law enforcement forces, and they were taken away for days and days on end. Their relatives, their families didn't know where they were. Obviously, these people were tortured, subjected to inhuman treatment. The same applies to people that are officially in prisons. Human rights defenders, that is to say, any activist that is considered opposed to the regime, are also targeted. Lawyers are targeted too, most specifically those that defend people that have been arrested. Female activists seems to be particularly targeted. These include those that had the courage to put their name forward for the elections and had to flee the country afterwards. There have been cases where female protesters were threatened because they were taking part in protests. One possible sanction could have been that they would take away their children. This is particularly cruel, as this is a threat and it implies putting these people under pressure. This obviously targets specifically mothers and women. Then students from universities and not only are also targeted. They are arrested, they are beaten up. This applies to high school students too. Academic freedoms, as was said, are but a segment of the freedoms that everyone should enjoy as citizens. However, as more than 261 students, as the UN High Commissioner said, were arrested and many others have been injured, is quite worrying. And this is not to mention the teachers and professors. We don't have any statistics related to them, but we can imagine that there are probably quite a lot of them. This is against the backdrop of the impunity that is enjoyed by the leaders of the regime, but also anyone that carries out their orders. There have been sanctions. We know that the European Union adopted back in 2006 a regulation that allows to impose so-called smart sanctions. I believe a few years ago, more sanctions were imposed. I think we've now reached 88 sanctions against Belarus, and more specifically against people that currently are not allowed to, for instance, enter European countries. Their assets have been frozen. If they have them, we're obviously referring to bank accounts in EU countries, and so on and so forth. Lukashenko and his son are among the people that are targeted by these sanctions. Do these sanctions work? I cannot put my finger on it. The idea is to target people whose reputation abroad is already widely compromised. The respect that people have for them outside the national borders is next to none. Professor Di Gregorio stated that Belarus is in the shadow of the superpower that it borders with. The European Union imposing sanctions on these people, if anything, pushes them even more into the arms of their eastern neighbor. I do not know how this can make things easier for Belarusian citizens. The same could be said about the European Union or the US. The way I see it, and I'm obviously referring to us Europeans here, both on an institutional level and in terms of civil society, but also the academic community, the more we are credible in managing our own affairs, this, for instance, refers to dealing with problems or situations where democracy is attacked. This is the case within the boundaries of the European Union. I'm referring to Hungary and other countries. So the more we are consistent in tackling these issues that lead to a lack of the state of law and attacks to human rights on the inside, the more credible we will be in imposing more sanctions. This would allow us to take a tangible stance on a diplomatic and political level against these dictators. I'm saying this because alongside intergovernmental pressure and measures, which by all means need to be kept, something else must be done. If these sanctions have led to the Council of European Union talking about Belarus, and if these keeps on shining a light on Belarus, then this is great. Alongside these measures, however, we should also foster a relationship involving the civil society. We should break down the walls encircling the Belarusian people, the people that currently are in Belarus, not those that managed to flee the country. There are people still within the country that are still subjected to the regime. We need to establish a very direct relationship with the civil society, with activists, organizations, so as to have a direct relationship with them. This relationship will then work hand in hand with intergovernmental measures and make them even more credible. As I was saying, governments adopting specific measures against dictators who may be closer to home than we think is not always efficient. We know that there are other countries in Europe where academic freedoms are not respected, where scholars are imprisoned or tortured, yet the Italian government has not adopted any measures against those. I'm thinking of Turkey, for instance. We are all very aware of this, but there are other countries that are closer to us too. If we are able to therefore break down these walls that have been built around Belarus by its own dictators, we will do so because the governments are taking a stance, but also because we, as citizens, are doing something. Scholars at risk, therefore, and any other organization or entity that allows us to interact directly with the Belarusian society are extremely useful and precious. All of this should be our priority. If we don't do this, sanctions, any measures that may be taken by country, I fear may not achieve much. Because the country could always turn to its neighbor, as I was saying earlier. Thank you. Thank you very much to all our speakers. I am speaking on behalf of all the students of Movements for Freedom, and I would like to thank you all of them. I would like now move on to some of the questions. I see that one of our speakers had to leave, but if there are any questions, you're more than welcome to ask them. I don't see any questions. Therefore, we can probably wrap up the event. Thank you very much to all of the speakers. Thank you. Thank you for organizing this meeting.